College Conference on Global Diversity. I've seen some of the faces at the other talks, and I want to thank everybody for presenting. Before I begin, I want to call Sally up. She's supposed to be here. She's all there. Sally Douglas. Without Sally, knows what happened. When it's all said and done, she'd all work. So.
Enjoy it.
The other hand, great. This is all good. Before I introduce Jeff, I want to kind of give a quick discussion of how we got to this point. Jeff and I have known each other we met about, what, 15 years ago? Yeah. And when we moved to Minnesota, he was here, we reconnected. Turns out that our work, while under very different guises, meets in a particular place. And it meets this question of, well, place. What role does place play in human flourishing? Those who've had my class, I know that my philosophy, I'm always pushing this question of place, how we relate to the location. Jeff's work, interestingly enough, crosses there because what we're going to argue is that how we understand our relationship to place informs what it means to flourish. Right? But in that is a question of value, which has been kind of this thrust of this discussion for the last 2 days. Where does our value come from? How do we know that the value we're choosing is the correct value? Is there a correct value? All these kind of questions. Well, in trying to focus that question, we have found that how one relates to the land exposes how we relate to meaning, to value, and ultimately to place. And Jeff's work, the book I just presented, Sally, The Forest for the Trees, and if ever there was a person whose name was predestined, right? Jeff Forester, right about forest. You don't believe in destiny? Well, there you go. When I first read this, for the first time I taught my this class, I don't think I saw right away the connections. But we've been working on this now for a couple of years, and over the process I've realized, and certain things I've got to show you, have shown that not only is the question of place the right question, but when we look at the different ways of relating to it, we can actually start talking about the right value for us. It's not going to be limited just to one's religion, one's philosophy, one's politics. But there is a way to relate to the land in a way that allows it to flourish, and we can see that flourishing. But we've got to be very clear what that means. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker, and if you could give a round of applause, Jeff.
A little bit about me. We are from northern Minnesota. My family came from, let me get set up here. My family came from Cornwall. They were Cornish tin miners. Cornwall is in the southern tip of England, and as they opened, and in this area you can see here kind of what the landscape is like. Here's a pointer. So it's these high plateaus with these valleys. And what these valleys were, they're river valleys. And tin is the ingredient that makes bronze. So you mix tin and copper and you get bronze. So when people talk about the Bronze Age, what they're talking about is they're talking about Cornwall. Because the largest deposits in Europe are in Cornwall. So Cornwall has been an active tin mining area for about 5,000 years. So getting back to Shane's idea, I guess, people in Cornwall, really, it's all about the minerals. And what happened there was, as the New World opened up, the value of the Cornish tin fell because there were tin mines, tin sources closer to the surface, other mines opening up around the world, and the Cornish were the ones who knew how to get the tin out, or in this case, the iron ore. And so my ancestors moved to northern Minnesota to the Sedan mine. He got there in 1884, 2 years before the mine opened. He died in the mine and left his wife and 6 kids on the frontier, up in northern Minnesota. At that time, there was no railroad, and there was a trail that you had to walk in from Duluth. And so my family's been in northern Minnesota ever since. What I remember as a kid was this. My grandma had a place on the shore. This was kind of the Boundary Waters. How many people have been to the Boundary Waters? Okay, so and I suppose everybody knows about it. And I guess I'll say something if this, the boundary waters is a wilderness. This is something that I believe. This is something that I believed when I began this book. I'm a writer, and my master's degree is in creative writing, and I was in northern Minnesota working on my master's thesis, which was a novel about the Cornish tin miners in northern Minnesota. We met a guy who was on the board of the Wilderness Research Foundation, and I got a grant to write a book about the history of logging in northern Minnesota. And when I began that book, and really I guess the story that I'm going to tell you is about place sort of informing me. And place not only informing me by presenting me with facts or truths so much as questions. Pretty much the process, one of the things I learned from writing, fiction in particular, is that what you know is sort of immaterial to what you ask. That the question is more important than the fact of what you know. For instance, there's two different types of fiction, and we all get it sort of intuitively. There's this novel fiction, where you can sort of tell what that thing is, and then there's genre fiction, like a romance or a western or something like that. I believe, and I've talked to other writers about it, is the difference between those two things is really a matter of question. When a novelist begins a novel, they don't know how that novel's going to end. They discover it as they write. When a genre writer begins a piece, pretty much they have it all blocked out and they know how it's going to end. It's a romance, and so the girl gets the guy, or the girl doesn't get the guy, or the guy doesn't get the girl, or whatever. I mean, you kind of know what these endings are. This book, I thought I knew the end. I thought that northern Minnesota was a wilderness, and I thought that it had not been logged, and I had all these preconceived ideas about it. One of the first things I learned about northern Minnesota is that it's a really important place. This is a map of the vegetation in Minnesota before European incursion. So this is what it looked like. And what they did was they went through, this guy Marshner, went through all of the old surveyor notes. The surveyors would carry these books and they would write about what they encountered as they were surveying the land. Oh, I passed through a great stand of white pine today, or it's all swamp, or the oak trees are magnificent, and they would write these little notes to themselves. So this guy went through and he color-coded a map. Northern Minnesota is the only place in North America where 4 ecotones overlap. This green represents kind of the end of the white pine band that comes all the way from the East Coast, Maine and Vermont, New Hampshire, across Pennsylvania, over the top of the Great Lakes, and terminates here. This is the western edge of it. And then from the north, from basically the North Pole, you have the boreal forest, which is spruce, fir, and aspen pushing down from the north. And this is the southern terminus of that forest type. From the south, you have the big woods, a little house in the big woods, the oaks, the elms. There's a place on Highway 12 out by Long Lake. You go out 394, turns into 12. There's a remnant stand of big woods there. It's one of the largest left. Most of them have been cut. And I'll share this with you right now because it's really kind of a great thing. What happens in the big woods is right after the snow melts and before the leaves come out, the sun hits the forest floor and all these wildflowers flush, like anemones and violets and just a bunch of different, and they kind of form like big colorful drifts. It's absolutely gorgeous. And then when the leaves come out, it shades the forest floor and the wildflowers go away. So, if you have a mind to see it, now's the time, probably within the next 3 or 4 weeks. It's pretty spectacular. And then from the west, we have the plains pushing in, the arid plains. And here's kind of a map of everything you can see right there. So one of the things that was happening in northern Minnesota when I started this work 15 years ago was this was one of the Centers for Climate Change study. And because if you're in the middle of Nebraska and you've got 500 miles on each side, as climate change shifts plant communities, you're not going to see the change, right? But if you're on the edge, you can see these plant communities move. And if you've got a couple of edges to study, now you've really got something to look at. You've got some good questions to ask. So this is one of the first things I learned about northern Minnesota. My ancestors came for the iron ore that was in the ground up there, which is kind of an interesting thing. The first people went for gold. There was a gold rush in northern Minnesota. That collapsed. The iron ore started in the 1880s, and at that time, there was no logging up there. The rivers in northern Minnesota flow north, away from milling centers. The only way to get the logs out was with train. The logs themselves weren't worth enough to really, justify building a railroad system up there, but the ore was. And so once the trains were in for the ore, they used those same trains to haul out logs. And this is, Roloff was a guy who went around and photographed a lot of these logging camps. And much of the work that I did was really looking at these logging camps and what they cut and how they operated. It's really a remarkable story. This is a water tanker, so they would run their sleds on roads built of ice. This tanker has sprinklers in the back end of it, and they would take it out onto a lake, cut a hole in the ice, haul a barrel up with horses, and fill the tanker full of water, run it out on the roads in the middle of the night. These ruts would cut grooves in the snow, and then the sprinkler would cover those grooves with water, which would freeze, and they would make these enormous log sleds that could be pulled by just a few horses. And when they cut everything. They cut it all. So the first thing I learned about northern Minnesota, the Boundary Waters Wilderness area, was that it was logged. And it was logged intensively. The whole thing was cut, which, I'm a little kid, and I'm going for walks in the woods with my grandma, and here's these big pine trees. Those were either little trees when they logged or grew up after. So the pine that's in the, I've looked actively for old growth stands of white and red pine in the Boundary Waters, and there's just a few small pockets, nothing more than 10 or 12 acres. Some of them are 300-400 years old. A lot of those on Seagull Island burned in the last fire up there. So there's not a lot left, really, in the Boundary Waters. Here's another shot of the logs. You saw the first shot, the logs were bigger, right? This is a little bit later, and the logs are starting to get smaller. And then near the end, the logs are considerably less. And this is what we cut down. The big money in logging is always the first people that get in, the first trees. Logging is a migratory industry. It's always been a migratory industry. The land of Africa, North Africa, was the whole Gilgamesh myth of the forests, and Rome cut North Africa. Today it's a desert. Iraq, Iran, this whole Fertile Crescent, that was a rainforest. Think Oregon coast when you think those areas 5,000 years ago. And then as it gets cut, people move on, and they cut all the way through Europe and now all the way across the United States. And after here, they went to the Pacific Northwest. This is kind of the upper Midwest. The dark green is the pine, the yellow is the aspen, the brown is that hardwood forest. This was pre-European incursion, and this is post. So, dramatically different. That was pre, and this is post. The pine, oak, and northern forest types are half of what they were pre-settlement. Aspen and birch and non-forested areas are more than double. So you say, okay, so what's the point of that? Okay, does it really matter? And it does, in that when you're talking about climate change, it'll kind of has implications there. Forest distribution also influences other things like fire, and I'm going to talk a lot about fire. One of the things that that people talk about is that logging imitates fire. That we can let me see here. That we can cut and log, and it will mimic the natural processes of fire. But one of the things that's not true, and one of the ideas behind that, or justifications of it, is that Lee Frelich, who's a really well-known Minnesota researcher, went and looked at areas that had been burned and areas that had been logged. 25 years after logging, the seedlings had dispersed just 20 meters from the seed trees. And disturbance is how you regenerate new forest. So you have a forest growing and it is pretty static, and then the wind comes and blows it down, or somebody logs it, or it burns, and then you get regeneration of the forest. You get renewal of the forest. So logging, you get distribution of seedlings about 20 meters. 25 years after a burn, the distribution was 80 meters. So the whole forest dynamics, the fire burns hotter going up a hill and less going down a hill, so you end up with a mosaic. It'll burn around things. Logging treats every square inch the same. So the result of logging, one of the big kind of impacts of logging, this is just a sort of another area, and you can see pretty much, or another slide showing sort of the differences. But one of the big things that logging causes is fire. And in northern Minnesota, we get about 25 to 30 lightning days a year. And following logging in northern Minnesota, we had fire. This was the Peshtigo fire in 1871. This was the first really big fire. This is about 1,200 or 1,800 square miles. It burned in about 6 hours. This fire started over here and was moving west. It hit Green Bay and jumped Green Bay. That's, miles across there. There was a lumber yard on the shores of Green Bay. They would cut the trees, mill them into boards, load them onto boats, and take them down to Chicago or other places out on the Great Lakes, New York and so forth. So all these stacks of lumber out on the shore as this big fire comes in. And it hits those stacks. People see the fire coming. They get out of their boats. They go 7 miles out of Lake Michigan. The sailors out there reported burning planks raining down on the decks because the fire was so intense. The convection sucked these piles of lumber up into the air and blew them out the top. Massive fire. This type of fire is called a plume-dominated fire. Hinckley was the next one. So all these people are saying, well, we got to conserve our forests. We have, we're cutting them all. Remember, they started on the East Coast and cut all the way across. They got to Minnesota. This was the end of the white pine cut. People are saying, oh, we need conservation. We need forestry. We need to, protect our forests. Well, this was the thing that convinced me. 800 people dead. This fire was 420 square miles of burned in 4 hours. Leveled everything. The way a plume-dominated fire works is you have a temperature inversion. So you have cold air over hot air, so you create a unstable system. This air is trying to compress down. Underneath that layer, you have a fire of big enough basal area and enough energy that it punches through that inversion layer. And then what you've got is you've got this cold air from the upper atmosphere rushing down, the hot air rushing up, and the whole thing starts to turn. You get a tornado of flame. This one went to about 50,000 feet high. Literally sucks things from the ground up, blows it out the top. So now you've got this molten stuff blowing out the top and raining down miles from where the fire is. This is brimstone. This is biblical. This is what people were dealing with. And this was big enough to change behavior in the United States. And they said, okay, let's have forestry. This was really the thing that triggered it. 1895, or 1894, I guess. One of the things I'll share with you today is that the conditions for this still exist. If this is a naturally occurring event, if the conditions are right, yes?
Jeff, I'm from that area, I'm
Yeah.
okay. And when I think about the Inver fire, I think about the fire that followed.
Okay, yeah.
That fire of 1980.
Yeah.
Was that different from this one?
I don't know if that fire was a plume-dominated fire.
Yeah.
I think that fire burned for a few weeks.
Yeah.
And it kind of flared up. Right. This will not happen in an old-growth forest. How many people have been camping? Right? You try to build a fire. You take a big round log, like an old-growth log, and you throw it on the fire, and the fire goes out. For fires, you need little sticks, you need little trees, you need forest that has just been cut and is growing back and it's small. The trees are seedlings, they're prone to drought, they can dry out quickly. Logging creates fire. This idea that we can cut our way out of fire hazard is flawed. It isn't how it works, but we didn't know that. We thought, okay, we got to put all the fires out. We had our motivation. The environmentalists, I guess back then they were called conservationists, jumped on board, the Arbor Day people, and they said, yeah, fire is the thing. So we had a national mania. Put out every fire. We built fire towers everywhere. We had phone lines. The first phone lines that were installed really across the country were installed to deal with fire. Telegraph, telegram, road building was justified for fire. After World War I and World War II and Korean War, now we had all this military surplus, so we started putting planes in the sky. We had lots of people to jump out of them. The motto became every fire out by 10 a.m. the morning following its report. So one of these planes up in the air would see a fire. They would call it in with the coordinates. They would get somebody out there by ground if they could. If they couldn't, they would jump in smoke jumpers to put it out. 1944, here comes Smokey the Bear. Only you can prevent forest fires. Probably one of the most successful public relations behavior modification campaigns in the history of the world. And very patriotic. Protect our country, fire is bad. Now until this time, people used fire. Farmers burned, people burned. Most of the wood east of the Mississippi, most of the forests were burned. Farmers used fire to clear forests, to get the trees out of the way so they could plant. So this is a pretty big shift in thinking, this idea that fire is bad. Disney came out with Bambi about the same time, and I would make the case that Bambi is the most powerful environmental film ever made. It changed behavior. Hunting went from something that was good and necessary to something that was foreign, and you were killing Bambi, and the fire component of it kind of added to Smokey the Bear. And for the first time in the history of North America, we became kind of flame-free. We put fires out, no more natural fires building. So this is late 1800s, back when the Hinckley Fire happens. By 1905, we have the creation of the Forest Service. They hire a guy named Arthur Carhart, and they ask him to go to Superior National Forest and pick places to put cabins. The Forest Service is going to rent out cabins to people. This is one of the things they're going to offer on the National Forest. So Carhart paddles around the forests up there, and he's mapping them, and this strange thing happens to him. And the people who've been in the Boundary Waters will probably know what I'm talking about. He has a spiritual experience in the woods. Because he isn't seeing anything. Because he's all alone, moving through the wilderness. And he thinks to himself, there's not a lot of places left in this country where you can travel for a week or two and not run across a road or a town or something else like that. So this guy Carhart comes back and he writes this report. And he says the forest supervisor, the regional forest supervisor at the time was this guy Carl Stahl. And Arthur Carhart writes, unless we save some places like this where people can really escape to the fullest the grind of routine living, we're just not going to have any outdoor sanctuaries left. 2 years later, Carhart runs into Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold had been in the Gila wilderness out in New Mexico, and he had had the same realization. He had gone up hunting, he had been moving through this landscape that didn't have any buildings, didn't have any roads, didn't have any people, and he had a spiritual experience. And so now this idea of wilderness comes about, right? This idea that wilderness is something that has value, that wilderness is something that should be preserved or protected or managed for. That somehow there's humans, and then there's this thing called wilderness. And that for humans to be healthy, we have to go to the wilderness every once in a while or have wilderness. This idea percolates for a while, and by 1964, it becomes law. And it was a Minnesotan, Hubert Humphrey, who was the one who came up with the law. So now in northern Minnesota, right, by looking at this weird patch of land that my ancestors ended up in northern Minnesota, I've come to the realization, you know, up there is where logging started, when they started logging up there with the horses and everything that you saw. It was family operations, and it was without mechanization. By the time they finished the cut in the 40s, really, it was the way they do it now with chainsaws and logging trucks and all that. So it was if you study that area, you see the shift from pioneer logging, which is the way it happened, you know, in Europe, or, you know, basically in Caesar's time with axes and chains and animals, to industrialized logging of Frederick Weyerhaeuser. You look at this area and you see these overlapping ecotones, and you begin to get ideas about climate change. This reflects on a much bigger issue than just northern Minnesota. And now you see something that's never happened before, where people has come from seeing this great cache of natural resources, this country, this bountiful country, and thinking we need to preserve part of it. I mean, back, you know, the Pilgrims never thought we need to preserve part of this. They were just like, cut it down, get it out of the way, burn it, do whatever you can, eat it if you can, burn it if you need to get rid of it or it will heat you. And the Wilderness Act is really a great piece of language. This is the definition of wilderness in the Wilderness Act. An area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. So if humans are involved, it can't be wilderness. Okay. Where man is a visitor who does not remain. So if man goes there, he's only there for a little while and he leaves. Where it has its primeval character. So what they're talking about here is pre-settlement. So it looks like it did pre-settlement. It has no human habitation. And it's managed so as to preserve the conditions which created that primeval character in the first place. And then northern Minnesota, right, becomes a wilderness area, but we already know it was totally logged. So the Boundary Water Canoe area, wilderness? I don't know. You know, so I begin to sort of question this. And that's a big change in thinking, you know. So in my book, Forest for the Trees, we can't see the forest for the trees, there's the thought there. How humans changed the North Woods. The first thing we did was we removed all the pine. We suppressed the fires. The result was the fires got hotter and more intense. We saw that with the Hinckley thing. Deer were a species that did not exist in northern Minnesota pre-settlement. It was elk and caribou and moose. So we introduced deer, which eat white pine seedlings. So we kind of made sure that white pine is not a forest type that would return. And then we turned the area into a wilderness. We took this area and we said, okay, now, we've done all this stuff to it. We're going to throw a legislative wall around it. We're going to call it wilderness. Well, now there was this guy, Bud Heintzelman, and the Marshner map that I showed you in the beginning was given to me by Bud. Bud was this guy, he was a little guy. Some friends of ours who they had gone on a canoe trip up to Hudson Bay. And the kids had come back and they had slides of their trip. And so they invited everybody over to see their slideshow. I go to the slideshow, and after the slideshow, they introduced me as this guy who's working on this book about logging in northern Minnesota. And this little guy goes, I worked up there for years. What are you learning about? And I'm like, well, they cut all the trees down, you know. They did all this logging up there, and it changed everything. And he goes, no, the logging didn't matter. I said, what do you mean the logging didn't matter? He said, well, the logging didn't matter. That isn't what had the big impact up there. I said, well, what had the big impact? And he goes, fire. We suppressed fire. I was like, I didn't get it. You know, he gave me the map. I thought the map was nice. I kind of blew it off. I finished my book. I did read Bud Heintzelman's stuff, and what Bud had done is, Bud had gone through the boundary waters, and he had found trees that were old growth trees, these little pockets scattered across the boundary waters, and he had found fire scars in these trees. So the fire comes, let's say, from the west side, and it's moving east, and so the side of the tree that gets hit with the intensity of the fire will kind of scorch a little bit. Old growth forests aren't killed by fires. So picture pre-settlement northern Minnesota forest, these big white pine trees, no branches within, let's say, 30 or 40 feet of the ground. Fire moves through on the ground, kind of these small fires, cleaning up brush, every once in a while kind of flaring up in a place. And so Bud maps the fires and how they happen. And he draws lines around areas that burn. This is the Boundary Waters wilderness area, the outline of it. These are the fires from 1610 to 1692, and then he mapped them in progression. So you can see where the fires were, where the fires moved through the area. This area here in the center, right, that was old growth. Right here are the two arms of Jackfish Bay, a big lake, and there's these big white bays. So in that area there, it hadn't burned. The fires moved from west to east. The water had protected them. These were the big pockets of pine right here. This is what we cut. He found out that in the Boundary Waters, about 10%, 10,000 acres a year burn in any given year. That any given patch of ground up there had fire move over it once every 30 years. And then we make it into a wilderness area, and then July 4th, 1999, this derecho comes through and blows it down. But when it blows down, is great. Here's the area that was logged, here. These white areas are the areas that were logged, and so the record was lost for Bud. He couldn't map the fires there because the trees had been taken away. Right? So after it's logged, it comes up in aspen and what you would expect. This big wind comes by on July 4th, 1999. Look at what it blows down. It blows down exactly what we logged. The areas that weren't logged didn't get blown down. Right? So logging creates the conditions for fire. Because here's what it looks like now. It's the world's largest bonfire waiting for a match. Right? These are the exact conditions for a plume-dominated fire, or a real intense fire. Their solution has been to go in and break the landscape into kind of a checkerboard pattern, and they're actually bombing it with fire bombs from helicopters when it's kind of humid enough and they think they can kind of control it. So here's our evolution of this idea of wilderness, untrammeled by man, right? So we throw this wall around it, but what happens? Because of our choices, because of the things we've done, it blows down. Now we're in there with helicopters setting these fires. Here's the effect of our management on fire in the United States. We've gone from most of the fires being low severity, these ground creeping fires, to these super high intensity fires that we see on the evening news. What's happening in northern Minnesota right now is happening all around the world. Australia had a plume-dominated fire a couple of years ago. You look at this graph right here. I investigated this blurb in the data, and they started counting things differently, and so there's that weird jag in the data. But what's been happening is from basically 1950 until 2000 is the number of acres burning is going up, the number of fatalities is going up, the number of fires is going up. And what's happening at the same time, it's kind of slowed down with the economic downturn, is people are moving out into the woods, right? Everybody's got their house kind of out on the edge. So in Colorado, which is one of the areas that has the most development in the country, or Arizona, where people are building up on ridges, and they build their houses up on the ridges, or in Southern California. This is kind of an interesting story. So I published this book, and then I go to Hollywood, and I sell a screenplay based on a plume-dominated fire to this guy, Lorenzo de Bonaventura, who is the guy who made Transformers. And he's a funny guy. He's very animated and very funny and real smart. And he's got this big house up on top of a hill in Southern California. So I write the screenplay, my writing partner and I write the screenplay, and we send it to him, and he's reading it. And the fires in Malibu, this is like 4 years ago, are going on. And so the ash from the fires in Malibu is falling down all across Southern California. So he's sitting in his shorts out by the pool in LA, reading this manuscript, right? and ash from a fire in Malibu is falling on the manuscript and it completely flips out. And I get this phone call, he's like, oh my God, so like, what are you saying? And like, my house on top of the hills. I'm like, yeah, dude, I mean, it's California, it's gonna burn, you know? Like, so, Lorenzo, here's the deal with fire. Fire is a weather event. We can't put them out. Does every fire out by 10 a.m. the morning following it? We might as well say, every snowfall over by 10 a.m. the morning following. We can't do it. We can suppress it for a time. We had a pretty good 40-year run, but this whole time these fuel loads were building, right? And not only that, but we're pre-selecting the most destructive fires, right? So you see a puff of smoke on the landscape, and somebody calls the smoke jumpers, and they go in, and they jump in, and they put it out. 99.9% of the fires that started in the United States are put out within the first few hours. When we were doing our research for this film, we got to go to the interagency fire centers and check out kind of the machinery of the fire service. And they literally have a huge room with like 100 people at computers, dispatchers, and they have a huge monitor on the wall, which is the entire continental United States and Alaska. And they have monitors all across the landscape that show where lightning strikes hit. And they can record. They record every single lightning strike. Every time any bolt of lightning anywhere in the country hits the ground, these guys see it, and they look. They send a plane over to look and see if there's anything burning. If it's burning, they send somebody in, and they get it out. The only time they don't get it out is when it's really hot, and really dry, and really windy, and it escapes that initial attack, and now they can't get the fire out anymore. They get out of the way, and the fire burns. And these are the big fires you see on the nightly news. So it's kind of drizzling a little bit, and lightning strikes something, and you get one of these creeping fires I was talking about going that would actually reduce fuel loads. We put it out. That's our policy. We put it out. Put out every single fire. Put out every fire in the boundary waters. And one of the things that happened to me with the Boundary Waters book, and maybe I should get into it at this point, was, so I finished the book, and I sent it to my editor, and I'm doing the fact check at the end, and the book is due to be out in, X number of months. My wife gives birth to our daughter, and I'm looking at the numbers, and Bud Heinzelman said 10,000 to 12,000 acres a year within the boundary waters burned in any given year pre-settlement. I look, and because of his data in 1984, they said, well, fire might be sort of a naturally occurring thing in the boundary waters, and because of this Wilderness Act, we want it to be natural. So if it's a human-caused fire, we're going to put it out. And if it's a natural fire, we're going to let it burn. So in 1984, they started letting fires burn in the boundary waters. And they called it the Wildland Fire Use Rule for resource management or something like that. Under that model, they were getting 1,000 acres a year burning as an average. So here I am in the late 90s, early 2000, or 2003, I guess, 2003 or 4, looking at these numbers going, well, wait a minute. Why aren't we getting 10,000 a year burning in the boundary waters? Why is it only 1,000? And I couldn't figure it out. Bud Heinzelman had died, so I couldn't ask him. And I'm like, this is a big problem, right? Here comes this book. It's on the Minnesota Historical Society Press. It's peer-reviewed. Some smart guy like Shane is going to read it, and he's going to be like, wait a minute, what about this, discrepancy? So I go back to doing research, and what I find out was that most of the fires that burned in the continental United States pre-settlement were set by Native Americans, by American Indians. That the fires in northern Minnesota were set by American Indians. That the white pine that we cut, which is a fire-dependent species that only moves because of fire, was there because of the fires that the American Indians had set. That the Great Plains existed because of the fires that the American Indians set. That the Shenandoah Valley that was open and so rich with game was there because of the fires that the American Indians set. That Southern California, where Lorenzo is now reading the script, was once a vast grassland. I read these journals that these Jesuit guys wrote, and they traveled from Mexico up to San Luis Obispo, and they complained the whole time, every day, there was nothing to burn. They froze because there was nothing to burn. There was elk and caribou and animals to shoot all over the place, but they had to eat them raw because there was nothing to burn. Because the Indians burned it every year, every other year, to keep the fuel loads down, to create the grazing for the animals. I learned that the Indians, so in northern Minnesota, about this time of year, let's say, down in the southern Great Plains, the buffaloes are all down there. The American Indians set fires, and they burn the grasslands as they go, and the buffalo move up to the north as the snow melts. They get up to the northern Great Plains. The American Indians hang out there with the buffaloes through the summer, and in the late fall, they set fires, and they drive all the buffalo back down. And guess what's happened? Grass likes to grow after it's been burned, so the grass down south is now all green and fresh and great, and they've created graze for their herd for the following year. What I learned in that month was that all the things that I thought that northern Minnesota was this wilderness area, this steady state ecosystem, was wrong. That the wilderness area in northern Minnesota was the cultural artifact of a people that died right before white people really got here, before the Europeans saw them. You know, this whole idea of the guns, germs, and steel, which hadn't come out at the point I was doing this, but all that research was starting to percolate. You know, I had assumed that there was very few American Indians on the continent, that they lived in this kind of harmony with nature and all this stuff, that they, you know, took very little and left very little trace and all this stuff. It's wrong. The population of the central Mexican Valley, which is densely populated, reached pre-settlement populations in the late 1970s. And what was the number you came up with for the...
For the American, just for North America, like 200 million.
200 million.
And that's quite low.
When Columbus landed in America in 1492, there were more people living here than there. There was more American Indians on this continent than there were Europeans on that continent. They all died right after we got here. Death rates were about 90%, 9 out of 10 died like that. Most of the stuff that they had built went back to zero pretty quick. They didn't have personal property ownership, so they hadn't subdivided the land. So here come all these people, these Europeans walking in, they go, wow, look at all these buffalo, the sky dark with birds, the whole thing, this is great, you know? And they didn't see the signs of farming. They didn't see impacts on the land because they were looking for stone walls and the stuff that we saw in Cornwall. They were looking for barns. They were looking for the things that they saw when they managed a landscape. They didn't see them here, so they assumed it hadn't happened. So, I got a month with this book. I've just had this realization. I got a new baby. I call my editor and I say, okay, so the book is all wrong. And she says, oh, you know, what are we gonna do about this, you know? And I say, well, I think I need to rewrite it. And she goes, oh, okay. And I say, well, I want to follow this fire thing and do this whole, this whole thing. And she goes, okay, that's great. And I say, okay, so how much time do I have? And she goes, well, no, it's just a month. We're going to press. So, yeah, do it in a month, you know? So I kind of did this massive rewrite on the thing in a month because I was too stupid to see the forest for the trees. That's about where the title started to come from. I didn't know what I was writing about. It was a process of discovery, you know? And then I was like, oh, of course, that's what writing is. So, but anyway, so here's Lorenzo. And here's our sort of larger cultural context. He's freaking out because he owns a house on top of a ridge in Southern California where the fires are getting worse and worse and worse every year. Oh, thanks. And this is what we see on the news. These are the fires, you know, that are on the news. Here's a fire moves through this area. But look at this. This is interesting. Here's this house that didn't burn. This is another house up here. See? Didn't burn. So I'm doing my research and I see these pictures and I'm like, oh. And you read the headline from that talked about this fire, the miracle house. Doesn't burn, the miracle house. So I'm like, well, geez, you know, what happened here? So here's a full-on fire coming right at the house. This house is toast, right? No, it's not. Right? So why not? Right? So okay, fire is a natural occurring thing. It's like snow or rain. It's a weather event. When it gets hot enough, when it gets dry enough, when it gets windy enough, the woods are going to burn. If you live in the woods, you're going to burn. Well, maybe not. So we're doing our research for this movie, and we meet this guy, Jack Cohen. And he's this little guy, and he's very thin and wiry, and he's just got like all this bouncy energy. And he is the fire sciences guy in Montana, in Missoula, Montana. And he had just had a baby too. So we're talking kids, and we're talking fire, and he goes, oh yeah, I went out in the backyard, and my kids were playing with matches. And I was like, oh geez, and it was like dry. In Montana, it's dry. I go, what'd you do? And he goes, oh, well, we got down and we were playing, we were setting all kinds of stuff on fire, and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, so, okay, you catch your 6-year-old playing with matches, and you play with them, right? Right, okay. So this is a whole different idea, you know. I instantly became fascinated with this guy. So he does these experiments. This is one of them. They went up to the pine forest in Canada, these big jack pine forests, and they cut them into 500-meter blocks, so they can kind of control it, and they put all their instrumentation. These are the smoke shelters that the fire jumpers have. So if you're a smoke jumper, you got this little cellophane pouch, and this big hairy fire will come screaming at you, and if you want to survive, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to step into this thing, pull it up over your head, and flop down on the ground. And then the fire burns over you, and you survive. Maybe. So they have that, and they have, you know, instrumentation and stuff, and they see what happens with these fires. This is going to be Jack Cohen.
We are observing in real time an intense fire spreading towards us, as seen through a camera that has been thermally protected. Heat is transferred to the dead and live vegetation ahead of the flames. Then the heat decomposes the vegetation into flammable vapors that we see as smoke rising ahead of the flames. Here is the same scene in slow motion. The flammable vapors, the actual fuel, mix with oxygen from the air, and when a combustible mixture has been produced, it ignites, and the flames advance. The edge of the advancing flames defines the location where the requirements for combustion first occur.
So where the requirements for combustion first occur. So if you interrupt, so here's a kind of the bigger view of this whole thing. That was Jack Cohen's voice, by the way. So I found out I was doing this, and I called him. I said, could you send me some cool stuff? And so this is what he sent me. Big crown fires, though. Big fires that they set. And they would set them on one side and move these fires across these study plots. And this will, in a minute here, we'll get to some. So they set up sections of wall, kind of in front of the fire. This is about 30 feet from the front edge of that big study plot. And they made it look like a house. Here's the same shot from behind it. So you can see the fire advancing. The whole thing gets consumed by fire. You can actually see it's burning right now. Look at that, it's on fire. There's a guy in a smoke jumper whose head just fell off. So this wall is burning. That's part of the house. So these are the requirements for fire. It's 30 feet from the front of that edge. The super intense heat of a wildfire lasts about 56 seconds. So you get this hot, intense blast, and then when the fuel is gone, the temperature starts to drop off precipitously. So the curve is like, you know, builds like this, kind of slow, spikes, and goes back down again pretty quick. And there you can see the wall is burning there. But look at what happens. This is now from the other angle. You're watching this wall burn right here. And the smoke jumper was on fire and just went out. The super intense part of the fire will stop. And the wall goes out. Without the heat driving it, it gets scorched, but it doesn't burn. So there was no little sticks. There was nothing there to catch that wall, keep that, sustain that burn on that wall. So these houses that we saw before were built in such a way that they could withstand the fire. So Jack Cohen told me he'd walk through like the fire in Los Alamos and stuff, and he could look, like if somebody had a raffia doormat on their front porch, well that that would burn, that would catch the fire brands, that would catch the house on fire, that would take the house down. Or somebody would sweep out their cabin and then leave the broom by the front of the door on the porch as they left. Well, we get in the straw. People would stack their firewood under the porch, that would catch. So it was all about how people perceived fire. If they perceived that fire would come someday, that it was, guaranteed that the forest around their house would burn, and they removed the fuel load within 30 feet of their house. Didn't have bushes up next to their house, didn't have firewood under the porch, didn't have trees overhanging, removed all the vegetation, had a 30-foot space around their house didn't burn. We would build houses in the woods with gutters to catch the rain. We put roofs on them so this rain and snow doesn't fall inside the house. We do all these things. And Jack Cohen's idea was, well, just build houses to withstand fire and do prescribed burns. Set the woods on fire and reduce the fuel load. And that's the way to deal with it. Here's another experiment that they did. And you can see in the front part of this picture, there's no treatment. This is just the dense forest the way it is. And here they cleared it out, created pre-fuel treatment. It was 2.5 meters about. Post-fuel was about 4 meters between each tree trunk. And then here's a picture of the fire they put through here. So they lit this side on fire, and it races up to the top. In this picture, it keeps racing because there's no treatment. In this picture, here's the line where the treatment begins. The fire can't carry. So here's that forest later. This is where the fire, this line right here is where the treatment began. These are a couple little small spot fires that started because the fire brands were burning stuff that kind of fell down on the floor and it's still burning. So Jack's idea is, well, if we keep our forest thin, they won't sustain a wildfire. We also went on that same trip. I don't know, do you remember the Hayman fire in Colorado? It was right on the outskirts of Denver. When we were writing our screenplay, we decided, okay, it was kind of a fun deal. They said, well, let's burn Los Angeles. We'll have this big plume-dominated fire racing into Los Angeles, and then we can make the movie here, and I can be home every night for dinner, and all the actors are here anyways, and it'll just be a lot easier if we set it here. So the writers and I were like, well, my writing partner and I were like, well, yeah, except nobody cares if LA burns, And they're like, really? I said, yeah, you guys don't have such a good reputation in the middle of the country. I mean, so LA burns. It's like, well, geez, it's LA. They've got a fault. They got everything, and it's going to fall in the ocean anyways. Who gives a rip? They're like, that's not true. So we literally sat in Lorenzo's office and called family around the country. I'm calling my mom. I'm like, Mom, so what city in the country would you really hate to see destroyed? If you could pick a city that you would just hate to see destroyed. She's like, oh, I just love Denver. It's so beautiful, or Seattle. Some got some Chicago's. My friend Jim Berg is calling his mom, who's from here. And she had been to St. Louis once and really liked St. Louis. And so we're like, see, nobody. We're like, what do you think about LA? And they're like, who cares, And we got that answer about 10 times, and I'm like, okay, fine. So pick a different city. So looking at where it's most likely to happen, where a plume-dominated fire would happen, Denver's a pretty good bet. So we go to Denver. About 3 years before we go there was this Hayman fire. This area here, if you look right here, this is the outskirts of Denver. So these are kind of the suburbs right in here. This is Denver itself. This Hayman fire shut down Denver for about, 2 weeks. It was a long time. The planes couldn't take off. So we go to Denver. Immediately we fly in, and they got that canvas-covered airport, right? Has anybody been to Denver? It's like a big tent, and I'm like, ooh, boy, this is going to burn great, And we meet this guy he's like a cowboy, he's got cowboy boots on, and he's the fire marshal for this county. And he comes to talk to us about this Hayman fire. And this area here is the Hayman fire, right here. It started right here, and maybe you've heard the story. It was a Forest Service employee this woman, and her husband broke her, her boyfriend dumped her, and she was all upset, and she burned this love letter from him in a fire grate, and it got out of the grate and got into the brush, and the fire took off. And the fire, and this is a classic fire shape. They start from a point, right, and then the wind's blowing behind them, and they spread out and move like this. They're kind of like a football shape, generally a football shape. Well, this guy, Jack, the fire marshal guy, like 3 years before, had said, well, our forests are too thick. There's this big fire hazard. He had set a prescribed burn. His prescribed burn was this area right here. And it sent smoke down into Denver. And they said, oh, no, it's too smoky. Put it out, put it out, put it out. And because it was a controlled burn, it wasn't hot necessarily. It wasn't super windy. It wasn't, the relative humidity was kind of high. They had set it at a time when they could control it. They could get it out. But the truth about wildfire, right, is if it's a wildfire, once it escapes that initial attack, you can't put it out. The only thing that puts it out is it runs out of fuel or it starts to rain. I mean, that's it. So I say to this guy, well, what about all the scooper planes dumping water and doing all this stuff? He goes, well, you can maybe save a house. You know, they talk about the fire contained. Anybody who's in the smoke jumping service, they said fire's contained, they're like, they laugh. You know, I said, well, what is all this stuff? And he goes, it's taxpayers' show. You know, they can't have a fire and not do anything, right? Because everybody's going, put it out, put it out, put it out. The reality is you can't put it out. It's a wildfire. You can't stop the rain, you can't stop the snow, you can't put the wildfire out. But we got to look like we're putting it out. So the way we put it out is we burn it when we can control it. His point was, well, better the fire you can choose, better the fire you can choose than the one you don't. So he had started this fire, and everybody complained down in the city. They said, oh my gosh, it's too windy, and they made him put it out. A couple of years later, here comes the Hayman fire, ripping through these canyons, 68,000 square acres burned. And there's a, yes?
This Hayman fire, this was started by accident?
Started by accident, right? And so the Hayman fire comes ripping along. We flew over it in 2005, so 4 years later. And the deal with these high-intensity catastrophic fires is they're not ecologically beneficial. They burn everything. It was black. There was nothing growing. They had burned the seed stock. In many cases, they burned away the topsoil. There was nothing coming back. It was, these mountain ridges that were just devoid of vegetation. But here's an interesting thing. So here is the line where his fire, this is the area that he did prescribed burn on, right here. So if you burn it when it's cooler and wetter and get that spacing, you clear out that brush, it is beneficial, right? And you stop the wildfire. The Hayman fire comes ripping along, and it hit his fire and went down to the ground like we saw in that other picture and went out. So, yes?
How, you said it was like devoid of life for, what was it, 3
Years, yeah.
How long will it take for trees and stuff to come back?
I don't know, a long time.
Oh.
Yeah, a long time.
Got to get the topsoil.
Yeah, there's no topsoil.
So like 100 years?
Maybe.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, in the boundary waters where they had that last fire, they actually, like on Seagull Island and stuff, they actually lost the soil. It's rock. So these hot fires, right, they're really destructive. So you say, well, why don't we build these prescribed fires? Well, the reality is there's no budget. So I'm running the National Forest, and I go to Congress and I say, yeah, I need, $1 million to do these prescribed burns on these areas. And they go, oh, geez, we don't want to raise any taxes. We can't spend any money. We got this deficit. We can't have the money. Fire starts. It's burning. It's heading towards Denver. Everybody knows we can't put it out. And we say, we got to do something, we got to do something. Well, then they open the checkbook. A fire, once it starts, all the money that's spent trying to put these fires out once they start, that's outside the budget. You spend whatever you spend. And it's reaching $5 billion a year now. When I finished the book, 6 years ago, it was about, 3. But fires, there's more and more and more, and they're getting more and more intense, and they're getting bigger. So then you just spend the money, right, and send the bill to Congress, and they pay it. And think about these fires. I mean, you go on one of these fire lines and it's like, thousands of people working these fires. The batteries for the headlamps and the flashlights that they use, the bottles of water, the meals ready to eat, the porta potties, the vehicles, the gas, the fees that they pay the airports, the telecommunications equipment, the whole infrastructure. It's a huge, expensive circus. It's a huge industry. And all of the incentive is to not change anything, right? Except for what's going to happen finally is people are going to get killed. And I think what'll happen, my kind of little prediction is we'll lose a town like Ely. We'll have a plume dominated fire, some really big ripping fire that'll take out a town of a few thousand people. It'll be this huge national disaster. And then we'll change policy. My attempt with selling the screenplay was to kind of try and demonstrate that. And I'm sort of holding my breath because once that natural disaster happens, like New Orleans or something like that, well, now you can't really make a flood movie about New Orleans because it would be in bad taste, So after we lose a town like Ely or, I don't know, some small town in Colorado or some town in Southern California or something like that, and it makes the nightly news and it's a terrible disaster, and we see all these images of these burned people, all these people who died, like those images we saw at Hinckley, then there'll be this national cry and we will shift policy, but I won't be able to sell my movie anymore, so that's kind of a bummer. So I'm kind of hoping that it doesn't happen real soon. But so here's another thing. This is a Man Gulch fire. This was on August 5th, 1949. The temperature in Montana, this is in Montana, on the edge of the Gates of the Wilderness area, 20 miles north of Helena. Temperature hit about 100 degrees. Winds kicked up to about 40 miles an hour. They spotted a fire down by the river in the base of this valley. It was burning up the valley. They sent in the smoke jumpers. The smoke jumpers landed over here, and they were going to traverse. So they were going to follow this line, traverse across the face of the mountain, come in behind this fire that was burning up from down here. Right, it was burning up this way, come in behind it, and start to fight it, to flank it from behind. What happened was the fire turned because the wind turned. These guys were right here. They saw the fire coming at them. They started running up this mountain, right, to try and get out of its way. And to give you an idea of how fast this thing was moving, it was here at 5:45, it was here at 5:53, it was here at 5:55, and before 6 o'clock, people started to die. This yellow X marks the spot where the foreman of this fire crew was this guy named Wagner Dodge. And as he's running, he sees this fire coming from behind him. He thinks, I cannot run this fire. So he gets down in the grass and he lights the fire. And the fire starts to burn out. And then he gets in the spot where the fire just burned and lays down. And because there was no fuel there, right, the fire burns around him, and he survives. He was calling to his people to come and get in the burned out area with him because, but the fire was so loud that they couldn't hear him. And so they were killed. And he said that the fire was so intense that as it passed him, it was lifting him up off the ground, trying to pull him up into the air. And he survived this thing with this technique that he had seemingly invented. Everybody else was killed. 2 people survived. Actually, 4 people survived that day. 2 managed to get up over the top of the ridge. They ducked through some rocks and got up over the top of the ridge and survived. 2 kind of got into the rocks, got badly burned, and lived a day in the fire. And he wrote it out in his little black space. And this is kind of sort of the last idea. The Forest Service forms in 1905. And I'm reading all these letters that the foresters, they're sent out all over the country. And this one guy catches this American Indian guy kind of in Berkeley area, Oakland, California, which, remember, was all grassland. There was no trees back then, really. Catches this guy. There were some redwoods kind of up to the north. Catches this guy, this American Indian, setting fire and burning it, And he arrests him. And the Indian says, well, what are you doing, He goes, well, you're destroying the the national forest. And he goes, no, I'm burning it. He goes, well, no, you're destroying the national forest. And he sends this supervisor this letter telling him this story about catching this guy, this savage, who had no idea about the scientific benefits of modern forestry. And thank God we were on the scene to protect these people from themselves, right? And the Indian guy's going, well, if you don't burn it, then it's going to all grow up, and then we're going to get a big fire, and everybody's going to get killed. Which has indeed happened in Oakland, California. It was like 250 homes were destroyed, and I forget, 35, 40 people killed. And Oakland, California is like South Minneapolis, you know, I mean, it's like neighborhoods and stuff. So this guy got it. And I also read this thing about these American Indians are out on the plain, and here comes the thing. You can see the light in the sky and the fire advancing across the plains, and here's the wagon train moving, and the wagon train people all freak out, and they start trying to dig a trench and everything, and the Indians are standing there watching them going, what are they doing? You know, and the fire gets a little closer, and they bend down and they build a fire. They let the fire burn some of the grass, and they stand in the area that just burned, and the fire moves around and cooks all the settlers. Because they're beating it with blankets and all this stuff, and the American Indians are like, that's dumb, you know? So here's this guy Dodge back in the 40s, and he survives this fire by lighting a fire, this thing that he discovers, right? But here's a painting made by Remington in 1908, and that's exactly what these guys are doing, they're lighting fires. So, I mean, the idea, I guess the things that I ended up with, you know, when I started writing this book, my idea was that northern Minnesota was a wilderness. And now I would put forth the idea that northern Minnesota, before Europeans got there, was a landscape that was managed by a people. That the idea of wilderness never really existed. That the landscape that was here was not a wilderness, it was a cultural artifact. That maybe this classroom that we're in right now is no more natural or unnatural than the Boundary Waters is today. They're both the product of management, of manipulation of the landscape by a group of people for a purpose. You know, I'm brought back to the idea that, you know, if I think I know something, I'm probably on pretty shaky ground. And this is the kind of the last idea. This is the Bitterroot National Forest in 1909. So this was what northern Minnesota looked like. Pretty subtle. Northern Minnesota, there were woodland buffalo. Right? The last one died in 1972 in Itasca State Park. Can you imagine a buffalo moving through northern Minnesota right now in the Boundary Waters? Here was the same patch of ground after 40 years of fire suppression and management, right? The National Forest was created in 1905. 1909, they take a picture of it. This is what they inherited. They start managing it. This is what they got. This was the same patch of ground by 1989. This is a fire hazard. This is going to kill somebody. Right? This is what we've chosen. This is what our management is doing. Because we don't get the landscape. We don't understand the places that we're dealing with. Because it's out of context for us somehow. When I was at the writing program at the University of Oregon, I had a class with Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And his idea was always, knowledge is overrated. The question is what's important. And he would say, he said this to us in class, the answer is never the answer. What's really interesting is the mystery. If you seek the mystery instead of the answer, you'll always be seeking. I've never seen anybody really find the answer. They think they have, so they stop thinking. But the job is to seek mystery, evoke mystery. Plant a garden in which strange plants grow and mysteries bloom. The need for mystery is greater than the need for an answer. And I think that as we approach place, or as we approach sort of questions of diversity, looking at different cultures, and why people do things and who they are and what they understand, that this is really sort of the key to getting a deeper understanding, is not knowing, but asking. Or questioning. So that's what I've got for today. I got some sources if anybody's interested, but we'll leave it on Kesey because he's more interesting to look at. Does anybody have any questions? It's kind of a lot of stuff that I just sort of threw out there. Yes?
So if the forests that that we thought were there before were a product of Native Americans, what was the forest before Native Americans? Like, what's the true natural?
Ice.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a mile of ice, and then as the ice recedes, the people were there. And they're thinking the people were here 15,000 years ago for sure, but now I'm starting to see estimates of 20 or 30,000.
Just on NPR last week, an archaeologist argued he discovered bones that would date people here at about 50 to 60,000.
Yeah. So and that's the thing with those numbers. Whenever anybody looks at the number of people that lived here pre-settlement, it gets bigger. Never gets smaller. Every estimate is bigger than the one before. When they look at how long people have been here on this kind of thing, it gets longer. It's not getting shorter, it's getting longer. So I think it was like always, and then here there's like mastodons and these giant beavers and, the idea that Native Americans lived in harmony with nature can be dispelled with the idea that they pretty much trapped the beaver to the edge of extinction. Once American Indians realized there was a market for beaver and they could sell them to these white guys for like pots and pans and, whatever, well, they started trapping the beaver. They had a motivation to do it. They trapped the beaver. They realized that saber-toothed tigers ate people, so they killed them. They got rid of the cave bears too, So, even the flora and the fauna, it was a result of people making choices and managing the world around them. So, what's important is to know what you want. Because if you don't know what you want, then you end up with that mess that we saw in that last picture, where it's just kind of this choked out fire hazard, Did you have a question? You were looking. Oh, yeah, you. Oh, yeah, no, okay. Anybody else? Yes.
So I'm just curious, the tribes that are up north now, what has been your interaction with them about this research, and what do they think about it?
Well, that's a good question. I talked to a few people about it. I was up north once, and these Ojibwe guys had come back from a powwow. It was when I was doing the research. And we went out to this guy's house in the middle of the woods up there, and he was a sled dog guy. He had all these sled dogs out behind his house. And these guys were all fired up because they had just done the wolf dance at this powwow. And we had all this beer, and we were eating chili, and there was no electricity there, so they had a generator that they brought out, and they were running this generator to power this boom box to play this music for this wolf dance that they'd done. They're kind of doing this wolf dance, and people are getting kind of wasted. And I look, and here's a wolf, like right there, sitting there watching us. And I turn to this guy and I say, "There's a wolf right there." And he goes, "Yeah." I think it was bold, and we're doing a wolf dance. Jerk. I was like, so I offer that, they're when I present this idea to them, they're just sort of well, duh. One of the women, I interviewed a woman, Mary Anderson, who was Ojibwe, and I asked her about the logging. This was when I was on the logging trip. They'd cut down all the trees, and I was outraged about it. So I asked Mary Anderson, I said, "Well, what about when they cut down all the trees?" And she said, "Well, yeah, that was difficult." And I said, "Well, what was difficult about it?" She said, "Well, my dad was a trapper, and her mom was Ojibwe, and they'd gone up north, and they trapped all winter, and they were coming back into town to sell their furs, and they portaged into a lake, and the whole lake was full of trees. It was full of logs. So they had to carry their boat. So they had to get out of the boat. She stayed in the boat, and they had to carry their boat over the logs, and the logs are all moving. And if you fall between the logs, right, you can't get out of the water because the logs close over, and you reach up to pull yourself out, and the log just turns. So you can drown. It's real dangerous, So they're moving this boat across this lake, and they get into the next portage, and they portage into the next lake, and that was full of logs. And so they stopped her. She thought that was kind of a bad deal. Then she got sent to the U.S. school, the Indian school, in Tower, Minnesota. And I asked her about that. She was taken away from her family and put into the school. And she said, well, I missed speaking my language, and so I would go out. The only people, they wouldn't let us talk to the other kids in Ojibwe, so I had to go talk to the animals. I thought she was being poetic, you know. And then I continued my research, and I learned that ravens and wolves communicate. That a raven will have a sound that is particular to that bird throughout its lifetime, and when that bird dies, that sound is no longer made by the other ravens in the area. That they make for life. They've identified about 35 different calls that mean something specific, like the bird has fallen out of the nest, and you get a recording, and you play this, and all the ravens go down to the bottom of the trees and start looking around for the little birds, you know. I don't think she was being poetic. I think she was being literal, you know. But like we have discounted a lot of that information, and then, you know, you also think about, you know, the Dark Ages in Europe was brought about by the Black Death, which was, you know, maybe 4 people out of 10 died, and it caused a complete freeze on any sort of advance in our writing or philosophy or technology. You know, it really shut Europe for hundreds of years. Then you think about what happened in the New World, and you got 9 out of 10 people dying, kind of in repeated waves of disease. So, you know, we're probably looking at, you know, I mean, the culture is so difficult to really, I think, grasp in its entirety now. You know, I mean, I think it was all, you know, it was a lot of it was lost, I think. But yeah, the Ojibwe that I know up north just think I'm kind of dense, I think is the answer. Yeah.
During the wildfires, did you put in consideration of the wildlife in the area?
I'm sorry?
The wildlife in the area of the wildfires,
they get out of the way.
They get out?
Yeah.
Animals pretty small.
Yeah, I mean, they, you know, that's, you know, they have adapted to survive that, you know, fire ecosystem. And the little animals go underground and the big ones clear out. And then after the fire, everything comes back, like woodpeckers and all that stuff. You want to see woodpeckers and birds that eat bugs go to a burn zone after the fire because they're all there, you know. So yeah, the animals pretty much take care of themselves. In the big catastrophic fires, they get cooked. So because they can't get out of the way. They move too fast. Anything else?
What about the tribe in Wisconsin, the manage the forest?
Oh, the Menominee. So there's a tribe in Wisconsin, the Menominee tribal. They got their land in the 1880s, and they said to themselves, well, you know, and immediately as soon as they got the land, here's the loggers, and they're saying, yeah, you know, we should really cut this. You know, you really want to cut these trees down, you see, because then we should really cut this. And that'll be the best thing for everybody, right? If we cut this right away, we want to cut it right now. And they said, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do a timber survey. The 1880s. So the Menominee tribal, they bring in foresters from Europe at that time, and they do a timber survey, and they actually count how many board feet of standing timber is on their reservation. And they say, okay, we got 5 billion board feet of standing timber. And the lumbermen are, by that time, they've cut most of the rest of Wisconsin, and they're right on the doorstep of the Menominee tribal, and you know, the reservation going, yeah, by the way, we should cut this right now. Like, we should cut all these trees, you see, and then the trees would all be cut, and everything would be great, and we'd be rich, and the trees will come back someday, you know. And the Indians said, well, what we'll do is, let's cut them, but let's cut them in such a way that we increase the quality and quantity of standing timber on our reservation. So let's cut the trees in such a way that we produce security for our future generations. Nobody had ever thought of that as a way to cut trees. The way to cut trees was you cut them all down, you send them to the mill, and then you move on, right? It's a migratory industry. So they started cutting their trees. Fast forward to today, the Menominee Tribal Enterprise is 220,000 acres in northern Wisconsin, just north of Superior National Forest, which is 2.5 million acres. When I did the book, the Menominee Tribal Enterprises was cutting about, I think it was about 50 million board feet of old growth white pine. Old growth wood is much more valuable than younger wood. It's the grain is denser, it's much higher quality, it's much more valuable. Superior National Forest, 10 times the size, their harvest of white pine that year was 5 million board feet. So with 10 times more land, they were producing, just 10% of what Menominee was producing. They also did a timber survey on their land that year. They had 7.2 billion board feet of standing timber. So after 60 or 70 years of harvesting, not only were they outproducing the National Forest just north, they had more timber than when they started. They have the highest biological diversity in the upper Midwest. The Wolf River goes right through there. It's a wild, scenic river. That's the area with the highest biological diversity of the Wolf River. They have species of trees that grow in the Menominee Tribal Enterprise. Hemlock grows there. There's no hemlock in Minnesota anymore. It's lost. Yellow birch. It outperforms, their forest on their reservation outperforms the forest that surrounded the National Forest by any measure you care to use. And they do a lot of prescribed burning in the Menominee Tribal Enterprise. That's what you're talking about. But they just looked at the whole thing differently. Like, the way the loggers looked at it was, get the wood and get out. And build yourself a big house on the hill overlooking St. Paul and become Frederick Warehouser. Basically, this is another thing. When we created this state, what township and section range lines are? You see those on a map and the townships and the sections. So each township has 36 sections. Section 6 and 36 were set aside to provide revenue for schools. So they weren't homesteaded or anything like that. The lumbermen knew that because of this, there would be no legitimate settler on this land. So as they moved into the area, they cut those stands first and took those trees. The Senate, Minnesota Senate, began investigating this theft of timber in the 1890s. They estimated it at $53 million the year before, stolen from the school trust land. It's an enormous amount of money. That's like billions today. So we pay property tax now to fund schools because of the theft that occurred at the turn of the last century. And it's kind of that was something that I learned that I found shy. You guys probably don't pay a lot of property taxes yet, so it's not as outrageous to you as it is to maybe some of the older people. Any other questions? Yes.
Did you, since you were in northern Minnesota so much, did you ever do any studying of Isles Royale?
I haven't been out there.
Oh.
I really want to go.
Because I've read about it. There's been some logging, but it's so difficult to move everything that it's nothing to run tunnels.
Right. Well, and you know that road that goes up the North Shore?
61.
Right, and there's a tunnel. Right, there's two tunnels. And they just put it in, and the area between the two tunnels wasn't really logged very well. And so look at the trees as you go through those tunnels, because it's totally different. You go through the tunnel, and all of a sudden there's these big white pines, and then you go through the other tunnel, and you're back to like the aspen fir trees, Just as you're driving north, it's something to note. There's a small patch on Highway 1 from Two Harbors up to Ely, the Oliver Pines. But yeah, it was a totally different landscape. You read the early journals from northern Minnesota, the surveyor journals, and they write about riding horses. Can you imagine riding a horse through the boundary waters? It's so thick and dense. You can't. The two. It's completely different. It was that they used words like park-like to describe the pines. But yeah, I'd like to go to Isle Royale. I never have. My kids are now like 10 and 8, and so they're kind of old enough to do a little backpacking. And we're kind of planning a trip for this summer to go out there and check it out.
Oh.
Have you been out there?
I've read about it. I have like a book. I have a map at my house. I'm going this summer.
Are you? Okay. Yeah, I'd like to go. There's another place, Sylvania Pines, kind of where Wisconsin and Michigan meet up by the UP, over kind of in that sort of northeastern corner of Wisconsin. And there's it was a Sylvania light bulb. The heir for Sylvania light bulb owned a couple thousand acres up there, and so it wasn't cut. And basically the land that wasn't cut, the big tracts that are left, either they were inaccessible like Isle Royale, or some wealthy person owned them and they decided they wanted to maintain their own land, you know. And that's another place you can go see old growth. And there's yellow birch there and hemlock, and it's gorgeous. It's really pretty.
So,
yeah.
you know, that we got this conversation. The picture that shook me out of my dogma, if you will, when I wasn't sure about what I thought about everything, about the burning, was that picture from the Bitterroots. Because I grew up in that region, right? That's my kind of backyard, Montana, Wyoming. And I hike that country all the time. Yeah, it's dense. It's hard to travel through. When I saw that picture from the Bitterroots in the 1900s, that's when I realized just how widespread the policy was.
Right.
It sure appears they're just burning everything from East Coast to the West Coast, for the most part. And so this question that I always have is, I think we should have look at this question. Now we know the facts. You can present these facts, but nothing changes, right? Why? If we can show these facts, I mean, this seems pretty good evidence to me that a good burn and a good, you know, is safer, it's better forest, all of that. We have all these facts, why aren't we changing?
Because there's a huge economic incentive not to.
There you go. Money, now you got it, Dan.
Right, right. And you know, I mean, it's like a, you know, it's $1 billion a year industry putting fires out. We're all geared up for putting fires out. And most people don't get fire. I mean, like the modern Americans, how many people here can start a fire? You know, I mean, say, okay, go build a fire outside right now. You know, a lot of people can't. The only way they deal with fire is they have like a gas grill and they turn the knob and they push the thing, kunk, 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 and it lights. Or they turn their stove and it lights. Or they turn their ignition and it burns inside their engine. I mean, fire has pretty much been relegated to like, you know, a car cylinder or a gas grill or, you know, we don't know, we don't get fire anymore. I mean, instead of using pesticides and herbicides, they used to burn fields. Our friend Steve he grows grass, and they burn the fields in Oregon a lot, so kind of the idea of burning is more accepted out there. But if you were to start building fires around here and setting fires, people would be like, well, what are you doing? You can't, you know, fire's bad, right? Fire's dangerous. You can't just build fires, you know. So I think it's going to take a really dramatic event, like a bunch of people get killed in some catastrophic wildfire, before we change. We came close. They lost 23 smoke jumpers 4 or 5 years ago in, I want to say, Arizona. And so the Forest Service did a study as to what had happened to the smoke jumpers. And really what they came up with was that there's too much fuel. I mean, pre-settlement, the estimates are that there was about 1.5 tons of fuel in the boundary waters per acre. Now the estimates are 125 tons. So it's off the charts, the amount of fuel. I mean, you look at these pictures, and when you talk about fuel, it's all the little stuff, you know, it's all these little trees here. That's all fuel. That's all stuff that burns. So it's dramatic increases in fuel, and they said, so the solution is prescribed burn. But they realized that that was impossible because of the attitudes of the public. So now the smoke jumpers just back off. Like they just increased their distances and they increased their best management practices of fires and stuff, and they just won't put themselves in the same situations anymore because they don't want to get killed. But what it means is that the fires are going to get bigger, and the fires are going to, you know, and there's kind of even less work on the fires.
It's interesting to spin on the best management.
Yeah. I mean, why, you know, you can't get in front of a wildfire because you'll just get killed. You know, and then you look in Colorado or in hilly places where they're developing, and it's completely backwards. It's all along the top of the ridges. Right, and you hold a match and the flame burns up, and so the top of the ridge is where it's going to be the most intense and the most dangerous. And you've got one long road leading down, so a fire starts, and now if there's one accident, nobody can get out. So most people that die in wildfires now, of the public, die in car accidents trying to leave the wildfires, because of the way the roads are laid out. So we're not thinking about fire in any way at all as we put our sort of our infrastructures in place. When they had that big fire in California last year, I guess it was maybe 3 years ago, Southern California, the smoke jumpers got in there, and this one guy, Eric, that I know, we were talking to him about it, and it's called Fuel Model 49. They were doing backburns on Fuel Model 49. Fuel Model 49 is homes. So here comes the fire burning towards them. They got all these houses. They're trying to protect the city. So what these guys were doing was they were going through and torching people's houses. They could never say that. They can't be direct because the people's attitude, they wouldn't stand. You're burning houses? Are you insane? Well, yeah, if you're dumb enough to build it on top of a ridge in Southern California, and we're trying to protect the city, yes, we're going to burn your house down. Right? So it's a strange mindset. The gulf between what the smoke jumpers and the fire service people are dealing with and the foresters who get this stuff about fire and the public is huge. So I think that's why nothing's going to change. And that's why I think if there's a big disaster, then something will change. I mean, we had, people were talking about forestry in the United States for years, and nothing happened until there was a big fire and a bunch of people died, and they said, well, we got to do something. And the solution was the Forest Service.
So then, when you say that a big part of this problem could be just the fact that we're so disconnected from nature. I mean,
Right.
that sounds kind of Eric there, that the fact that when we think about building houses, we think about the best view,
Right.
as opposed to what's the most reasonable place to build a house.
Right.
So, how would you propose solving that, or at least trying to improve it? Do you think that if the public was more knowledgeable about nature and better connected to it,
Right.
that there would be greater awareness?
Well, I think so. And you said people are separated from nature, and I get what you're saying, that sort of these natural laws of fire and all these things. But really, it sort of stems from this this separation of ourselves from nature. Right? This idea of wilderness, the idea that there's this wilderness, there's nature, and then there's us. And we're somehow separated from it. The idea of building your house at the top of the ridge, you can't because of the fire, because we think we can control it. But you don't want to build your house in the valley either because of the flood. Right? So maybe you don't want to be in the foothills of the mountains at all. Right? And if you live in Minnesota, in the last 4 years, you've had to pack sandbags to protect your home from floods. Maybe you don't want to live in a floodplain. Maybe the United States shouldn't keep paying people to rebuild their homes in a floodplain, or to rebuild their homes in an area that's burned 5 times in the last 20 years. Maybe that's, I think really it would come down to insurance. Like if you're an insurance underwriter and you look at a house that's on top of a ridge in Southern California and there's 12 or 14 foot scrub filling the valley, I'd say, good luck, because your house is going to burn. Maybe not tomorrow, but at some point it's going to burn. Fire is inevitable, or the flood thing, So I think economics maybe could drive it. I think, and I think insurance companies are starting to shy away from, out in Colorado. When we were in Colorado, I actually went. They have all these houses for sale. We're outside Evergreen, Colorado, and I go in and I talk to the insurance person, and I say, well, what about the fire problem? There's no problem. No problem. Well, yeah, no, there's a problem. There's a fire problem. No, you can get insurance, and it's no problem, and blah, blah, blah. And then that area that we were in, the subdivision, burned completely to the ground like 3 years later. Like 500 houses lost in this area. But there was no problem because they got the insurance from it and they recovered. They lost all their photos and some people died, but So maybe it's the money thing that will drive it, or public outrage. Or, you know, people like all of us in this room saying, you know, I remember that guy talking about building your house on top of a hill, or, you know, maybe instead of building my home out, you know, side of Denver on the hill, I'll have an apartment in town or something, you know. I don't know, you know. I do know that the fire doesn't care. You know, it is what it is. Any other questions? Yes.
So you, in the conclusion was that you don't believe that northern Minnesota was wilderness, right?
I'm
So
sorry?
you don't believe northern Minnesota is wilderness?
Do I believe it is?
No, you don't believe, right? Like it's not wilderness?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I don't know what that word means.
wilderness?
Right.
Like, untouched by humanism?
Okay, if wilderness means untouched by humans, then I would say there's no spot in North America that is untouched by humans.
Yeah, that was another question.
Right.
Well, I even take a step further. There's a spot on the planet that's untouched by it.
Right.
I mean, I grew up in Wyoming, the mountains. There's no factories anywhere near Wyoming, but there's mercury poisoning the lakes. And that's not because the factories in Wyoming. So, yeah, good luck with that idea of untrampled on man.
I mean, the whole idea of wilderness, I think, was an idea that we had. You know, it's like your idea connected to nature. You know, do we understand nature? We had this idea of wilderness, but I don't know that it ever existed. You know, and I don't think that the people who lived here before us had any idea about wilderness. They just this is where they lived, you know, and they managed it like we managed the parking lot. You know, and they didn't have cars to drive, so there was no parking lots. They created habitats for the animals that they ate. They burned to create, you know, to increase blueberry yields, and you know, they burned to reduce fuel loads so that fires wouldn't come in and burn them while they were sleeping. You know, they had different motivations, but they were managing their landscape. So I mean, it's kind of an unpopular thing to say in Minnesota that you don't think the boundary waters is wilderness. But I will say that I go up there every year. We have land up there. I love it up there. I get kind of like a spiritual renewal when they write about the spiritual renewal. I get all that out of it when I'm there.